We'll get going into the actual session. Again, we're focused in on XClarity management tool today. Within XClarity, for those that may be already familiar with, in general, our management tools, we have the XClarity controller, which is the chipset built into all of our ThinkSystem servers that allows you to open up a browser or through a command interface, talk to that individual server. And then we have our XClarity Administrator, which is the tool that we'll focus mostly on today. XClarity Administrator goes off and manages multiple systems, so allow you from one pane of glass to see multiple servers as well as our storage devices and our network switches. In fact, one of the new things that we'll focus on today is increasing our support for those network switches. And then there's also the XClarity Integrators, which will allow you to take that information and data and functions and integrate it seamlessly into other tools. So, for example, very popular is our VMware Integrator, which allows you from our vCenter console access to data as well as functions like firmware updates and such. And one of the things we'll talk about today is our integration into Windows Admin Center, which is one of the newer ones. We'll do a little bit of a demonstration of that capability for those that are utilizing some of the new Microsoft Windows Server 2019 types of functions. So that is an overview of kind of what XClarity management is all about. I want to spend a little bit more time, again, just a very brief overview on what XClarity Administrator is. And so what I will do is launch this poll asking you to give us a little bit of feedback on how familiar you are with XClarity Administrator. And so kind of based on what I see here, will help me target sort of how much time we spend giving you some background on the general and how much detail people want to dive into, just focused in on some of the new features. So appreciate you guys responding to that. Looks like we've got over 50% of the people that are at least slightly familiar, seen the demos before. 30% are coming back saying already using it, and about 20%, a little under 20% that maybe this is the first time actually seeing XClarity. So with that in mind, again, we'll focus mostly on kind of the what's new parts of it, but I will spend a little bit of time giving you a bit of an overview for those now 17% that haven't seen XClarity at all before. I think you'll still get plenty out of this process. So again, in terms of that overview, let me just sort of start here and talk a little bit about what XClarity Administrator is good for. Again, this is a tool that is going to manage multiple systems. We ship this as a virtual appliance, so very easy to set up. You do have the web-based user interface that I'll show you in just a moment. And then all this chart just says REST APIs and PowerShell. There's actually all kinds of ways that you can interact with XClarity Administrator from that kind of command line based approach. The main functions are kind of in these 5 categories. Number 1 here on the left hand side is focusing in on being able to understand what systems I have, so the discovery and inventory of our systems, again, both servers as well as storage and network switches. Focusing in, by the way, on the Lenovo products when we come to that, right? So it's our Lenovo ThinkSystem, Think Agile products, the servers, the storage, and the networking associated with that. So we're not trying to manage other Dells or HPs or things like that, but give very good, deep management on our Lenovo building blocks, so to speak. So that's number 1, understand what I have, understand what it is. Number 2 is the real-time monitoring, so understanding if I do have a problem of some kind, I can see that not only in the XClarity console, but also being able to get that delivered outside of XClarity, forwarding an email, forwarding an SNMP trap, a syslog event, those kinds of things, as well as phoning home and connecting back to Lenovo support, opening up the trouble ticket, and providing information that way as well. Third area I think very important is managing firmware. And this is one of the examples where we want to go deeper because we can really focus in on the Lenovo products. We're able to integrate more completely into things like our own website, so delivery of firmware, understanding what firmware I need, downloading that automatically from our website, understanding what a best recipe is, downloading that from our website, and then application of those firmware updates with those best recipes and best practices is really a key advantage of using XClarity Administrator. Fourth area is what we call server configuration patterns. The idea of being able to set up the hardware more seamlessly, being able to define standards so that if I'm rolling out a series of systems or switches, I've got a consistent way to do that configuration that is both easier than simply going through, configuring each server one by one, and then also consistent that I know the machines are being deployed with the same settings. If I want to do things like turn off USB ports, I know that I can do that, and I know that's common across all of my infrastructure. And in some cases, even being able to monitor after the fact, know that I'm still compliant with those standards that I use for deployment. And then finally, pushing out an OS or a hypervisor, being able to deploy a system quickly. Again, a lot of cases, maybe you're buying an appliance or something, so that's not that important. You already have it from the factory with the OS installed. But in other cases, I want to get a simple, VMware load down to it, Windows or Linux, and so you can do that from within XClarity Administrator as well. So those are kind of the basic functions. Hopefully, again, those that are not as familiar with XClarity, that gives you a little bit of a background as to what the overall purpose of the tool is. Specifically focusing in today on our highlights from our recent shipping of version 2.4. In fact, just in the last couple of weeks, this level of code is out there and available. As is our practice with XClarity, quite honestly, you don't see a huge list of blockbuster new features. With XClarity Administrator, we're very focused on sort of the core management of the systems. Those 5 things that I just went through, those are the 5 core functions that we will continue to have and continue to focus on. We're not going to become as monolithic management tool that takes care of everything in all the whole world. But there are certainly things within those categories where we want to continue to enhance, keep pace of new operating systems, for example, for deployment and other features that customers are asking for. So we do continually improve our product, certainly, and so the functions that you'll see here that we'll talk about kind of focus in on some of those improvements. So what's new with version 2.4? And we'll demonstrate all of these, but number one, what we'll see is the ability to create custom roles. So I can now have a unique set of privileges for individual users. In the not too distant past, we had a little bit more constraints in terms of how we could do the users and how we could apply that to individual systems or not. What we can do now is, number one, have the ability to define different roles either for individual systems or for groups of systems. So you kind of have some flexibility in that regard. And what we're adding now is the ability to further define what those roles are. Previously, we had a list of, probably about a dozen different roles: hardware administrator, super user, that kind of thing, but predefined. And you couldn't go through and change things to customize how you might want to do it. Now, you can actually go and create a brand new role and choose specifically what authority you want that user to have. And so that ability to have those custom roles, I think, is really going to enable broader usage of the tool and allow people that perhaps before you didn't want to give them everything, but you wanted to give them a few things. Now you can really define exactly what that is. Again, I'll show you more of that as we go. Another key feature is the ability to configure features of our Intel Optane data center persistent memory DIMMs. This is a new feature announcement that came out with our latest ThinkSystem family of offerings, which we announced earlier in April. So one of the key features of this new generation is taking advantage of the DC persistent memory, and there are some configuration things to be done. And so again, part of keeping pace with the latest offerings from a hardware perspective is being able to do that not only from configuration patterns, but also directly from the system. Again, we'll demonstrate some of those things as well. Third area, quite honestly, I'm very happy to see is continuing to expand our capability to manage our network switches. This has been growing over time, and one of the things that I know customers have been asking for was to expand upon the basic capabilities that we've had in terms of monitoring and inventorying of the switches, some very basic configuration manipulation, to have much more of a function which would be comparable to what we do with our configuration patterns. Not quite the same. Again, I'll get into more details. We talk and demonstrate it. But the idea that I can create templates, again, for the idea of being able to enforce standards, that I can have templates of the way certain things should be set up on my switches. So I have perhaps certain VLAN settings that I want to have, and I want to quickly provision that across multiple switches. I can now have a standard template, and I can simply deploy those templates out to my switches to speed the process of getting those switches configured, and again, enabling the ability to have much more consistency in the way that actually happens. Speaking of patterns, going back to the server pattern side of it, another new feature is the ability that when I change things within an existing server pattern, I can decide which systems I want that to actually impact. And so in the past, what I would do is I would create a server pattern for, let's say, all of my VMware servers. And so every time I would get a new VMware server in, perhaps I would use the same pattern and I would have consistency across all of my inventory of VMware servers. Well, perhaps what might happen is that somewhere down the line, within the universe of all my VMware servers, perhaps there's a subset of those servers where I want to tweak a performance setting. Let's say I want to, I don't know, something like turn off multi-threading. Maybe some application that I'm running on some subset of these servers would do better performance if I actually turned off hyper-threading. And so I could go back through that and I could change my pattern, but then I could choose which servers I apply to. In the past, if you change the base pattern, it would automatically apply to all servers that you deployed using that pattern. Now you can essentially kind of fork your inventory, if you will, in the process that essentially creates a new pattern, but will automatically then assign it to the subset of systems that I select. So again, a little bit more capability to really control exactly how I deploy things and how I make changes to it over time. And I think that's going to be useful for a number of our customers. The next area is new OS deployment. This isn't something that I'll actually demonstrate because it's not perhaps all that interesting to watch some of these things get deployed, but we do support deployment of those new operating systems. Notice this is one that I know a number of customers had asked for, which is the ability to deploy the base VMware vSphere ESXi without the standard Lenovo customization. So as most folks know, we do still recommend that people do use the Lenovo customization aspects of it, but if for whatever reason you decide you don't want to use that, we do allow you to now deploy out the base VMware ESXi. So that's a new enhancement there. And then the final area is in regards to interacting with Lenovo through the service portal, so to speak. And there's a couple of things on there that will demonstrate that actually isn't listed there, but the one thing that is listed is the idea that I can attach additional files to my service ticket. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the key things that XClarity Administrator allows you to do is automatically open up those service tickets when you do see things happening, a fan failure or predictive failure alert of some kind. And so this allows you to, of course, it always gathers service data itself, but perhaps if there's some other kind of data that I need, that I think that the help desk could benefit from seeing, I can then attach whatever file I want to that service ticket, and very easily, I'll show you in a demonstration exactly what that looks like. So those are the highlights. We'll get into demonstrations on that. Other things I wanted to mention is we continue to enhance the list of XClarity integrators. These are not necessarily new within the last month or so. Some of these have been out there for a little while, but I always like to highlight that because it is something that perhaps if you missed the last update that we did, you may not have been aware of. Things like support for Nagios, which I know is very popular, ServiceNow, for example, Red Hat Cloud Forms. Those are all out there. You can see the links in there to either access the individual updates or to get to the full list. Feel free to explore that some more. The one that I will spend a little bit more time on, which had just kind of been announced the last time we did one of these updates, which is our integration for Windows Admin Center. And so what I want to do today is not just kind of talk about it, but demonstrate it. And kind of two key areas. One is managing an individual server itself, getting in and launching a remote control, power on, power off, understanding the server inventory, and of course the alerts and the health of the individual system. But also I think really valuable is our integration at the cluster level. So if I'm running a cluster of systems in a shared storage software-defined environment, which I know a lot of folks certainly are these days, hyper-converged type solution, I can see that environment and do things like do a firmware comparison amongst my nodes because, very typically in a cluster like that, I want to make sure that I'm running consistent software. Certainly I want to be running recent, but maybe I'm not running the most recent, but it's important to know that all the systems are at the same software level, firmware level. And so, things like a consistency check across the nodes in my cluster, I think, can be very valuable. And again, we'll go and we'll do some demonstrations on that here in just a little bit. I included a couple of screenshots, and we'll demonstrate this for you, but those screenshots are in the handout for further reference. And then finally, other links. The one thing I also wanted to highlight here is, once again, if you're not as familiar with XClarity Administrator, there may be a few things that perhaps you see during the demonstration that kind of go by a little bit more quickly than you might want if you're not as familiar with the base function. But that video playlist there, that link, please follow that link out to our YouTube playlist, which is a collection of videos that we've done here in the Briefing Center that I think give you a really good overview of all of the individual functions, as well as there's a couple of overview videos out there. If you see a little bit of what we do with server configuration patterns and want to know more about how that really works, what the functions are, the video playlist is a great place to go. And then, of course, there's all the other documentation, product guides, and those kinds of things that are out there as well. So please feel free to use those links to get a little bit more information as you need to. Okay, so that is all that I really wanted to talk about in terms of chartware. Let me move over and let's go look at some of these features more closely. Okay, so I'm going to bring up the interface. Okay, so here we are at the main console. Hopefully a lot of folks are very familiar with this, but for those that are not as familiar, you can just kind of see, right here on the surface what this is. This allows me to get a view of my environment. As we said before, XClarity Administrator is meant to manage multiple servers, stores, and switches. You can see in this case, I've got 60 some odd servers, a few storage devices, and a number of switches that I'm managing. I've got a few flex chassis as well. I'm gathering them into racks. Racks just being kind of a graphical representation. I'm not managing the rack itself. The rack is just a cabinet, but I can graphically represent them in meaningful ways. And then the resource groups, which was a relatively new add, not in the last couple releases, but before that, which allows me to then group things as I need to, according to either easily finding them or according to how I might want to assign roles for my different users, which kind of brings me to that first new feature that I wanted to show you, which is the ability to have those custom roles created. So if I go to the administration pull down and I select security, we'll go in here to local user management. Again, these things work whether I'm managing my local users, whether I'm using LDAP or an Active Directory type support. And what's new is the idea that I have these roles selectable here. So if I select on the roles, you'll see a list of the current roles, and these are the ones that are all predefined. So these are the ones that we've always had in the past with predefinitions of exactly what a hardware administrator versus an operator would do, different features and functions that would be available to those types of users. If I want to create a custom role now, I'm going to simply click on the Create button, and I'm going to give it a name. So I'm going to call this one, let's call it a server-only hardware admin, right? So in this case now, as we expand the usage cases for XClarity Administrator, there may be the case as we add more switch management capability, there may be a need now in my organization for a certain type of user that can do what they would want to do to my server elements, but we want to really remove some of the features of what they would do from a switch point of view, right? That's not unusual, right? That we might have people that would be, server but not network type roles. So I'm going to name it that. I could give it a further description if I want. And then I'm going to choose what of the existing roles I'm going to use as kind of a starting point. This is just to make it easier for me to select and deselect certain types of things. So I'm going to select the hardware admin as sort of the base role. And you can see now down the bottom that there are a number of privileges that are now populated in terms of what this particular user role is going to be able to have access to. And so in this case, what I want to do is I want to come down here to switch management, and use that pull down. And my definition here is that this person is not going to be able to have those kind of advanced management features for the switches. They'll still be able to inventory them, right? So if I come down here, right, they're still going to be part of managing, the overall inventory and understanding what's in there, but I don't necessarily want them to be able to do, changes to configurations and things like that. So, simply by unselecting those checkboxes, I've now removed a lot of that capability from this particular user. Now, and no reason why I would necessarily want to do that for this particular user, but I just wanted to show you also the level of granularity. I'm going to go to the firmware updates piece of this and show you that you've got a lot of granularity in here about how you want to do this. And there may be some cases where you really want to lock down certain responsibilities. And this is a good example where I could have this user that can really manipulate all things about firmware. We trust them to be able to download new firmware update packages, to be able to create compliance policies. But perhaps there's a level that says, but we just don't want them to actually be able to finally perform the update. That's going to need another supervisor level that's going to do that. So I could simply uncheck that box, right, and then simply save this and apply those changes. And now I've got this new user type down here, this new role that you see down here, server-only hardware administrator. Now, to take advantage of this, and this is not necessarily new, but just to kind of review how you might do this, you go to the role groups. And what I would typically want to do is now create a new role group, and I'm just going to call it, Dave Demo, where I can identify the fact that I want this this new role that I've identified, or multiples if I feel I need to do that, and then I can select from the user list and determine who on that list is going to actually be part of that role group. And by creating that now, I've not only defined the role, I've now assigned it to a set of people as part of this role group. So again, just a little bit more granularity. If it's being used in a small shop, I've only got 1 or 2 administrators, and typically they're going to have access to everything. But in a larger organization where I want to begin to now kind of separate things out and have specific people managing specific tasks, it really gives you a lot more granularity from that perspective. So one other thing that I should mention also, speaking of firmware, because we kind of manipulated the ability for someone to actually apply firmware. One change you'll notice here on the front dashboard is right here underneath the firmware updates. We do have a count of devices pending for updates. One of the things that we improved earlier is a little bit more granularity to say I want to deploy an update to a system, but I'm going to have it in pending mode, waiting for the next reboot, and a little bit more granularity over how you do some of those things. And so we've added that to some to visibility on the dashboard, so you can actually see if you've got a lot of devices that are in that pending state. You'll kind of be able to see that and track it also from the top screen. So a small update, but just wanted to point that out also. Okay, the next area that I wanted to spend a little bit more time on again is the switch configuration. So if I go into provisioning, again, folks may be familiar with the server configuration patterns. What we've added now is the idea that we can do switch configuration using configuration templates. So let's go into that and look at that a little bit more. And the one thing that I want to kind of highlight here, and I'm not sure I've got the right words to explain this, but this is a little bit different than configuration patterns. A lot of times you think about a configuration pattern, that is a standard, and it is if you will, a state that I want my system to be in. So all the things that I have inside of that configuration pattern, I apply it to a system, I set everything up in that one pattern, and then I can kind of I can monitor to make sure that I'm still compliant with that pattern. For the switch configuration, it's a little bit different than that. It's a little bit more broken up, if you will. So what you have is a series of templates, and I can apply templates that are going to set certain characteristics. So if I want to configure a lot of things within the switch, I might have multiple templates that I'm going to configure, and I have to be a little bit careful, quite honestly, in some cases, on the order in which I apply these. So if I have one template that sets up VLANs a certain way, if I then deploy that template, I know that those things are going to be configured. If I have a different template that perhaps overlaps and changes some of those things, if I deploy that template immediately following, the latest template applied is going to be the way that system gets configured and put out to the network. So it's just something to be aware of in terms of the way this works differently. These aren't full patterns. These are templates that allow you still to have the advantage of some of those some of the ease of configuration, certainly, and some of the consistency. So you see over on the left-hand side a list of the templates in different categories. So one of the key things that we're going to be doing is setting up VLANs. Certainly, that's one of the things you're going to do when you deploy your switch. And so I've selected the port membership configuration just as an example. You'll notice a couple of templates that are in here. If I select this and edit it, you'll see as an example here, we're setting up a trunk for ports 51 through 54. In this case, on one of the switches. So that's set up and VLANs assigned to that. And then on the other one here, just below, we have the server access ports being configured. And we'll see that these are for ports 1 through 48, and we're adding VLANs 10 through 20. So, right, the whole idea is getting the ports assigned, getting the proper VLANs assigned out to those devices. When I want to actually do the deployment, I can simply select the template name. I can select the deploy template button here. Oops. It will allow me to simply select which and perhaps multiple switches I need to make this change for. So you can kind of see the way this is going to work, right? Either because I have a new switch, a new single switch coming in, and there is, a number of different templates that I need to deploy out to this single switch. That's easy enough. Or maybe there's a change I need to make across all of the switches that I have currently installed. Maybe I need to, for example, one of the other things we can do here is we can do a remove VLAN. So maybe VLAN 20 needs to get removed urgently from a number of my different switches. I can select that template, and I can select a bunch of these guys to then have that VLAN removed from. So both ways, right? Either I'm deploying a new switch and I want to get it set up quickly, or I'm making a change to an existing environment and I don't want to have to log into each individual switch and do it manually, which of course you can always still do. But I want to make that change globally, or at least to a subset of my global switches. And you can see it's very easy to do that. So basically being able to add and remove VLANs from individual ports, being able to delete VLANs or add VLANs to the overall switch. Those are all things I can manipulate there. Port channels here, so I can configure this if I've got, for example, some NIC bonding set up on my servers for a larger pipe combining some of the 10 gig ports, for example, into a port channel pipe. I can then get the switch configured so it knows obviously to expect traffic in that manner. So you can do port channel configurations. You can do some things here from a VLAN tagging perspective. You can set up VLAG configurations here. You can do some things with spine leaf. So again, not complete configuration of absolutely everything. This is quite honestly the 1.0 release of this function. So we're kind of just getting started. But we try to get at the most common things that people would want to do and provide a way in which you could execute that kind of capability. And then, of course, there's also the history here. So if you want to see a history of exactly what's been happening, you can go through and it'll give you an idea of what exactly has been deployed. I can get in there, see that it was successful, see exactly which system, which switch it was deployed to. So I can go through and look through a history and understand not only what was done, but also the order that it was done. Again, the timestamp here is very important because you could have two templates that conflict with each other, and there's good reasons why you would want to have that certain switches configured certain ways. And so you want to be able to go back through and look at the order in which these things were done to make sure that everything was configured in the appropriate way. So again, that is sort of our first release of some of that more extensive ability to manage our switches. More on that to come in future releases, but I think that's a great start and certainly something that folks have been asking for in that regard as well. Getting back into configuration patterns, one of the other new things that I mentioned was the ability to apply changes to a subset of systems. So for example, here, I'm going to go and look at my VX configuration pattern. So this is a pattern that I use to deploy to all of our VX nodes in perhaps multiple clusters. And so let's say I want to go through and make a change to that pattern. So I'm going to edit the pattern here. Notice it says on top, in use. I've already applied this pattern to existing systems. If I make changes to this pattern and click save, the changes will apply to the profiles that are associated with that pattern. So again, this is a warning, if you will, that when I make changes to the profile, I'm going to make changes out. It's not going to automatically reboot the system, but if it's something that requires a reboot, it'll simply happen on the next reboot. But let's say, for example, I want to come out here and I want to change the way I'm treating my USB ports. In this case, I've got, for my cluster, I've got all of my USB ports enabled. If I scroll down here a little bit, you'll see my USB configuration currently are all enabled. Well, maybe according to my security standard, I want to disable those, and I'm going to now kind of save that as a new learned or extended UEFI. I'm going to simply call this one, well, I'm going to keep it simple. I'm just going to call it Dave No USB. And so it's going to change that kind of as my sub pattern. Notice that's now selected here. But the key new feature is that now when I go to actually save this, it's going to pop up and ask me, okay, which systems do you want to actually impact with this change? And so in this case, perhaps I have some systems that are, secure in my data center somewhere. I don't need to turn off my USB ports, but I have a couple of these systems which are in a less secure environment. So I do want to impact the change on that. And so in this case now, when I say redeploy, just to be specific, again, not to get into too much into the weeds, but for those that kind of know how this works, what it's actually going to do is it's going to create another pattern. And so it's going to essentially, if you will, fork the pattern at this point, because I still need to go back and be able to understand which systems are compliant to which pattern. So if this pattern changes, what I'm really doing is changing the underlying pattern and creating a new one to which I now want to compare the two systems that I've selected, and I want to still have the old pattern because the other three systems need to be compared to that pattern. So in this process, when I say redeploy, it's going to prompt me to name my new pattern, but it's going to allow me to sort of in a very managed way apply my patterns out to a subset of my system. So again, not a huge change in this regard, but certainly one that allows people to continue to take more and more advantage of that capability in areas where they need to have a little bit more of that control. Okay, so another thing on the config patterns that I wanted to highlight here as well is in regards to the ability to configure the new persistent memory feature. So I'll go back to one of these other patterns here, and let me just edit those. You can kind of see where that is. It's underneath the local storage. And so one of the things on the pull down here is the ability to now define my Intel Optane persistent memory. And so, there's basically two modes. There's app mode, there's memory mode. So if I don't do anything, it's going to all be in memory mode. But if I choose to split that up and assign a certain percentage of my persistent DC persistent memory into app mode, perhaps, as some of these applications are all SAP being a key one, they can take advantage of this new type of memory, persistent memory, in a different way. I'll be able to now come in through and configure this either initially or reconfigure a little bit later on to make that available to those applications. So without having to go back through and edit UEFIs, I can simply come in here and change the pattern, deploy the pattern, make sure systems are set up appropriately that way. The other thing associated with that persistent memory, I also want to just highlight real quickly, is being able to set the security for that feature. So if I come in here and select one of my systems underneath all actions and I select service, you'll notice that Intel Optane security operation is one of the new features here as well. And this allows me to set up the security because as persistent memory, right now that DIMM has got data on it. You may want to turn on security and make sure that it's encrypted so that if that DIMM moves, the data doesn't necessarily move with it, or at least if it does move, it's done in a secure way that you can't get access to it without the proper passcode. So again, that is another piece of the hardware management, hardware configuration, which is now part of XClarity Administrator. Okay, so that covers so far a number of different things. We talked about the custom roles. We talked about the switch configuration, some of the new changes there with the configuration patterns. The other area I wanted to do a little bit of a show and tell on is some of the changes that we've done with service and support, which I think are going to be handy for some folks. And one is the ability to put a system, what we're calling into maintenance mode. Now, this doesn't really have any connection back with with your hypervisor maintenance mode. I want to be very clear about that. This is not going to move virtual machines or anything like that. But it can be certainly convenient to be able to select a system which perhaps I'm working on, perhaps I'm decommissioning it, so there's going to be some problems about it. I'm going to be taking some features out of it, I'm going to be taking it offline. But I don't want the system to constantly to throw alerts or actually do things like call home. So what I can do now is select a system and actually put it into maintenance, what we're calling maintenance mode. I can either select an end date, a start and an end date, or an end date kind of thing. It's going to start immediately as soon as I confirm it, but I can decide, hey, for the next 3 days, this needs to be in this mode, or I can just say indefinitely, and it'll be that way until I take it out. But that can be handy. I know that happens around the briefing center quite often. We'll be working with a system, perhaps experimenting with it, doing a demo, and it's rather annoying to the support folks that it's constantly calling home and opening up trouble tickets, or to just throwing red lights to your console. So if you know a system is going to be kind of in that mode, you can put it in maintenance mode and temporarily kind of take it out of the monitoring action. Another thing that I mentioned earlier is the idea of attaching new files. So if I go to my service ticket status, you've always been able to attach, the standard service files. What's changed now, if I select an existing service record and select attach file, notice it's basically allowing you to browse for any file that you want. So if you've got some other kind of indicator about what the problem might be, some kind of a log file, software log file, or something else that you've gathered, and you want our service team to be able to look at that as part of the problem, now it's easy enough. I don't have to worry about emailing it to someone or whatever. I simply attach it into the service record here, right from within XClarity Administrator. So just, again, trying to make it easier and easier to interact with our support folks. And then the final change I wanted to make, and this is one that I've had a number of customers ask me about, we've always had the ability to track the warranty dates, which you can see is here when I select warranty. You can see here it's tracking start and expiration date based on what we have in our database. So this is, the kind of the final word, if you will, from a warranty expiration, whether it was, base warranty or an extended warranty that you purchased after the fact, whatever, you can see that here in the warranty expiration date. But what we could always do is alert based on an upcoming warranty expiration. What we can now do is simply change, what that warning threshold is. So instead of just getting alerted after, within 30 days, now if I want to see that alert within 90 days or however far out that you want, you can simply change that, apply it, and now you're going to get your notifications a little bit earlier in that process. So that's some of the enhancements there. And then the final thing I wanted to mention for folks that might use the jobs process, if you're running different jobs, this is an example here, just some power off things that were done. But if you're doing firmware updates, for example, you might want to be able to go in here and make notes, right? So things that might have happened for a specific reason or things that you want to make note about. Again, if you've got a small team, it may not be as important because, it's your communication is pretty straightforward. If you've got a large team and you want, somebody who's coming on duty after you go off duty to be able to see the same set of information, you can go into one of these specific jobs, and there's now a notes button that I can click on, which will allow me to put a note in here, put it at different levels, and some of these might actually change the status level from green to red, depending on what's investigating, for example, might change it from a green to a red. I can put the note in here, and then you'll have a list of all of the notes that are currently open for this particular system. So if you're working on a problem and you want to go in there and use this as a way to have that shared and available for all of my users, so they're not just having to go back and check email note strings or something like that, but it's now right here, all the information you need is right there associated with that system. That can be kind of convenient as well. Okay, so those are the main things that I wanted to cover about XClarity Administrator 2.4. We kind of talked about them, we demonstrated them, so hopefully that gives you a good feel on some of the new functions, new features that are available. For those that may not be as familiar with XClarity at all, hopefully along the way there you saw some of the basic functionality to look into the system, see the inventory, look at monitors, run jobs, and do config patterns and some of those kinds of things. So hopefully you got some good background on that as well. So what I want to do is shift gears here a little bit and talk about one of our XClarity integrators, specifically for Windows Admin Center. So Windows Admin Center, again, is a new feature of Windows Server 2019, which is available to allow customers more of a single console to manage the hyperconverged type environment, typically, as well as individual systems. And so what you see here is I've logged into Windows Admin Center. I've gone to the hyperconverged cluster manager. And what we see on the left-hand side is navigation to the standard Windows Admin Center features. So I have the dashboard that you see here. It kind of gives me that high-level view that all my drives are healthy, my servers are healthy, CPU usage, memory usage, all those kinds of things. A little bit of performance information down there at the bottom. I can get in there and manipulate virtual machines, switches, volumes, drives, those kinds of things. And then down the bottom is my extension. So all of this stuff on top is sort of the standard monitoring, if you will, and management of my Windows environment. And then if I click on the XClarity Administrator side of things, now we're getting into a little bit more detail about specifically some of the hardware things. So this is information which is being gathered from XClarity Administrator and provided within the Windows Admin Center framework. So I still have XClarity Administrator in the background. XClarity Administrator still exists. And in fact, I skipped over when I first logged into it. I had to authenticate with my XClarity Administrator server. So the data is coming from there. I just don't have to stop and log into a different console to get that data. If I live within Windows Admin Center, I see the data provided where I would most typically want to see it. And so in this case, now I'm getting a little bit more of a granular view. I don't have any red lights necessarily on my servers, but I do have some kind of orange triangles, if you will. And so you can kind of see one of my servers in that warning state, a little more granular information, right? So it's not an emergency, but as I drill into the hardware detail, seeing a little bit more information here. And in fact, if I want to see what those alerts are, I can come over here, view all, and we can see from the alert description, what we did is we just unplugged one of the power supplies. And so 2 alerts were thrown with that. One, the fact that the system is going into non-redundant mode now because one of the 2 power supplies is off. And then, in fact, identifying for me that power supply 2 has lost input. And again, notice the granularity of the data here, right? It's not power supply 2 has failed. It's actually noticing, right, the fact that it's not the power supply has failed. It's just that there's no power coming to it because we unplugged it. And so it's that next level of hardware awareness and things that our XClarity Administrator knows about and talking to the XClarity controller inside the server. We want to make that level of hardware knowledge available to the overall administrator here within Windows Admin Center. A couple other things in here. So again, power supplies. Notice that they're green. They're normal. There's nothing wrong with the power supplies. Just that one of them is unplugged, which was notified here in the alerts. I am tracking things like power consumption. I can get temperature information from the individual systems. I can see the fans. I mentioned earlier the idea of firmware consistency. This firmware consistency report, I think, is very powerful. In this case, the 3 servers that I have in this cluster are all consistent, so perhaps it's not the best demonstration of it. But you can see that everybody's reporting green check marks because they're all consistent in those core firmware elements that I want to track on this. If I had something that was at a different level, you would see that identified with the yellow triangles to say, hey, this one doesn't match the others. And it also allows you to choose, what the baseline is. And it's kind of an interesting thought if you do stop and think about it. If I had one server that didn't match the other 2, it might not be immediately clear whether that one is really the baseline pattern because I've upgraded that one and the other ones are behind, or if that one is the one that is behind. So this allows you to identify what the baseline is, what sort of good is, and then they'll do the comparison there to make sure that the other ones are all consistent with that, or identify the one that is potentially back level. And again, that's a key thing, especially if you're looking at these kind of cluster environments, that's something you want to make sure that all the nodes in that cluster are running at a consistent level of firmware. If I want to dig into the individual servers, this is kind of the cluster level view. I can go and look at the individual servers. So we can see certainly the list of servers in here, but I can also now dig into these guys. And if I want to see more detail about that individual system, I can come in here. I can get a better idea of what's happening on this system. I can see, those same alert information that I saw before. I can look at that more in historical context and look at the event log because if something like this is happening now, perhaps other things have happened in the recent past that I want to know about. So the full hardware event log is available here. I can also get more information about the power consumption and temperature, certainly. If I want to see more about the inventory, I can scroll through this in a fair amount of detail. As you can see, not just the firmware here, But as I scroll down here, and you can kind of see, this is very similar to XClarity controller interface. Over on the side, as I scroll, you'll see that it's kind of the keeps pace of kind of where I am now down to the processors. And if I wanted to just jump down to see, what my drive configuration was, I could do that simply by selecting on kind of the path over here. And notice, by the way, on drive is kind of a good example where we're not just gathering the basic information, but we're also, in the case of the drives, recognizing that some of these are solid-state devices, and I might want to track what the remaining life is on those devices. So as I'm sure you know, solid-state drives do have a life to them. Certainly the server class drives that we're using, we expect to have a longer life than the system itself. But if for some reason I've got a drive in there and I've got certain workloads running to it and I'm beginning to wear it out, you want to know about that. And so we're tracking that within this, and you can get alerts for it and stuff through XClarity. That's one of the pieces of data we might want to have access to here within Windows Admin Center. So all that is available here as well. And then of course also the remote control. So you certainly have access to these systems through the standard Windows level remote control. But if I want to get access to it at that console level, right, it's going to take me into that, logging into the XClarity controller automatically, and launching into that core hardware layer remote control, and allowing me to access and interact with the system that way. Notice there's no Java pop-ups or anything like that, right? So all this remote control is available that way. I can send it the keyboard sequence to unlock it. Since it's at the lock screen, right? I want to send control, delete, and log into it. I can do things like mount my media device. All the things that you would do if I logged into my XClarity controller directly are available through that. It's the same remote control. Again, just the idea being that I could get to that without having to stop and open up another browser window and type in an IP address. I can simply select Launch Remote Control directly from within Windows Admin Center. Okay, so that's kind of what I wanted to show you here. Again, another great example, similar to what we're doing with VMware, more things to come. This is our first release also of the integration into Windows Admin Center, so you'll see enhancements to that over time as well. But for those that are in that environment or beginning to move in that direction, I don't know that many people have already shifted to Windows Admin Center, but it may be something on your roadmap. Just know that we've got the ability to pull in that information from XClarity there as well. All right, so those are the things that I really had in mind to cover with you today in terms of the update. Let me see if we have any kind of questions that were asked that we might want to review in general. A couple of questions we'll have to get back on specifically. Ron, anything that on this list do you think we need to sort of give everybody an update on?
No, I don't think so. It's just the supported hypervisors.
Okay. Okay. All right. Good.
The last one we're investigating with the ServiceNow.
Okay. Yeah. We talked about the notes and the ability to have notes associated with the individual jobs and whether that will transfer up to ServiceNow. So John asked that question. We'll probably get back to John individually on that one as well. So let me just do this. We do have a couple of moments left. Let me look at the attendee list here. And what we can do is if anyone does have a question right now that they want to ask on the audio, what I'll do is I'll actually stop the recording. We'll wrap that up. But if you do have a question, I'll let you raise your hand. And if I see a hand raised here in the control panel, we can unmute your line and we can handle any one-on-one questions there. So with that, I'll kind of close the standard content. I will just hit the stop recording button.